everyone, and welcome to the True and Spotty Comic Book Vault. Sorry for my lateness in getting these reviews out, but it is an incredibly hectic month with numerous complex projects and a big convention appearance I'm preparing for at the end of the month. Today, I'm going to knock out my free Comic Book Day comics as promised, and I will have last week's regular books out as soon as humanly possible. I'm also working feverishly on finishing the amazing SpiderMan rewind, and then I will be plugging away at Spawn Year until it's totally finished. That's pretty much my summer. I want to say thanks to everybody for being patient with me, and I really appreciate everyone's support as always. And speaking of support, we have already surpassed our $1,500 goal on Kickstarter for the Midwest in Panels comic documentary that we're going to be shooting in just over a couple weeks now, and I cannot express my gratitude enough for everyone who's pledged and helped to make this project a reality. Everything for the movie is coming together amazingly. We have a new color logo by Rockman LP, which is phenomenal, and all the incentive stuff is being put together and looking really boss. I think we're going to have a really cool movie for you come December. And now, on to the reviews. Let's start off with Guardians of the Galaxy. This is a little one-shot by Brian Michael Bendis with art by Nick Bradshaw, and if you're reading Guardians and you don't pick this up, you're really not missing much. It pretty much just reveals how Venom gets recruited into the Guardians, which is fun, but it's not a rousing reveal or anything, and I might have expected that there'd be more to it, given that he just shows up in the main book, new and wide-eyed, to be in space, but with no explanation whatsoever. Tony Stark, it turns out, recruited him because he's not with the Guardians anymore, and the Avengers want someone with the Guardians to represent Earth and its interests, with all the crazy stuff that's been happening lately with Earth and space. And that's pretty much it. It's mainly an introduction to all the Guardians to uninitiated readers, not surprising with a movie coming out this summer. Tony's descriptions of each of them are clever and amusing, and it's fun to see a man with an alien symbiote that gives him legs and has a tongue that sometimes wraps all the way around his head in disbelief at the weirdness of people who are arguably no less bizarre than anything he's been through since he's become Agent Venom. I'm glad we got something free that actually adds something to the continuity, even if it's mostly just there to catch up new readers. It's sufficiently entertaining, even for those of us for whom this is all retread. A part of me really hates complaining about this, though, because, the price is right, but it's still a letdown to me that Marvel always seems to have to put out free comic book day issues that are only a few pages of new material and the rest are previews. Sure, previews for things to come, but you don't feel like you got a whole comic book on free comic book day when half the issue is smatterings of incomplete stories just trying to entice you to buy something. I want to be enticed to keep reading something I have to buy after getting a taste with an entirely well-done issue that I feel I really did get for free. And that's how the publisher and the reader can win on Free Comic Book Day. I can read 3-page previews for most things without leaving my house on Comixology. But anyway, the previews here are for Jim Starlin's one-shot graphic novel Thanos the Infinity Revelation, which looks like a real treat for old-school Thanos fans like myself, and it looks and reads like it's right out of the 80s, like Starlin never changed at all. I will definitely be picking that up when it comes out and reviewing it. The advertising, I guess, worked on me there. And there's also a couple pages of Dan Slott's Spider-Verse. But I was really confused at first because there's this ad for the amazing 1.1 issue right in front of that, and then nothing about Spider-Verse until the end. So I couldn't figure out why in the world an untold chapter of the early days of Spider-Man would include a Tudor-era 1603 Spider-Man. It looks fun and wacky, though, and I'll probably be reading it. Let's go on to Rocket Raccoon. This one is really odd. It's Rocket Raccoon as if he was an early 90s cartoon, and it reminds me a little bit of that grittier Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon, especially with all the personified animals with their species names and their given names. It's an all-ages comic, and Rocket is altered pretty heavily to be suitable for kids. Obviously, he's not running around yelling, murdered you, while he is blasting people, despite what the cover looks like, and it's really odd that he calls himself himself a raccoon when part of his shtick has always been that he's from another planet and finds it totally degrading to be called a raccoon. Anyway, he's basically just a wisecracking loner pirate who's mostly out for himself, but kind of has a heart of gold thing going on, so he'll put himself on the line when the situation calls for it. Here, he tries to save a princess who hardly needs saving, and doesn't entirely succeed at that. It's really odd that we got this okay but ultimately unmemorable effort from Joe Carnegiega and Adam Archer instead of something from Scotty Young, who's putting out a mainstream Guardian spinoff for Rocket in July, and it's a safe bet that he'll actually be murdering plenty of bad guys there and not calling himself a raccoon. I'm sure this was released to drum up excitement for that book, but it's awkward because it's not that book, so I'm not sure what the strategy was there, and it seemed a little rushed out to me. Then in the back, we've got a reprint of an Ultimate Spider-Man story, also by Carnegiega, which I like about as much as I like the idea of previews padding these things out, but at least it's a complete story. It's an Ultimate Spider-Man tale set in space, so it's at least appropriate to pair with the Rocket story, in which Spidey, Nova, and White Tiger go up against an absurd and generic doctor who has enslaved a bunch of hostile Toy Story-looking aliens from the planet Subservia, and he plans to use his deadly ray gun of death to destroy the Earth because humans aren't worthy of it on account of all that drilling and pollution. I'm not a big fan of Ultimate Spider-Man. I'm not a big fan of its humorous sensibilities, but occasionally there are some pretty clever, absurd things in this, like Nova pretending to be helplessly tied up until the bad guy inevitably explains his whole plan, and that kind of got me. Now let's go to DC, talk about Futures End number 0. This is a somewhat counterintuitive idea from a marketing standpoint, which I've kind of come to expect from the 52. I mean, imagine this pitch meeting. So we're going to do a 40-issue long weekly epic starring the characters from those books early on in 52 that sold so poorly we had to cancel them after about a year. And we'll set it 5 years ahead of current continuity, and we'll be really vague about whether it's the real timeline or an alternate timeline that's going to be changed by what's going on in the present day stuff, so readers won't even know if this thing is going to matter until the whole thing is over. And just to make matters more awkward, in September, let's interrupt every single series like we did with Villains Month to tie into this thing so that every collector will be forced to pay some kind of attention to it. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a fun premise here, despite its being yet another fix the future by going to the past story, which have not been in short supply lately. And I'm all for getting Terry McGinnis into mainstream DC continuity, even though it unavoidably requires, of course, a gimmicky, contrived time travel plot. I can't get excited about Spider-Man 2099 in present-day Marvel and then complain about this. Although, I can't help but raise an eyebrow at the suspiciously uncanny timing. I mean, are we seeing some sort of futuristic character war between DC and Marvel right now? Okay, so DC starts successfully publishing Batman Beyond, and Marvel thinks it's finally a good idea to bring Spider-Man 2099 back, despite the publishing validity of doing that like 3 years earlier when Shattered Dimensions, the video game, brought the character back into the limelight and instantly repopularized him with fans. And then DC sees that, and they feel like they have to step up their game by mixing their popular future characters by getting them into their mainstream continuity, sorta, kinda. I don't know, maybe it is a coincidence. Anyway, so in the upteenth apocalyptic future I've seen in superhero comics over the last couple of years, Terry and Bruce are fighting against an oppressive robotic force called Brother Eye, who Bruce is partially responsible for creating along with Mr. Terrific. Their attempt at forcing a controlled peace has backfired, and sort of like Ultron, this thing is taking over and assimilating people into its collective consciousness, deciding human beings are inferior and that everything must be Brother Eye. I really feel like I've just been here and done this plot, but I will admit that seeing major superheroes like Superman and Aquaman transformed into spindly-legged automatons with only their torso and heads intact, but still nearly as mechanized as their bottom halves, is eerie and unsettling, though I'm not sure how they managed to do that to Superman. Despite the contrived efforts of several heroes who couldn't engage a wide enough audience to sustain their own series, Brother Brother Eye is prevailing, and humanity's only hope is for Bruce Wayne to travel back in time to grab a couple of humpback whales to repopulate the species. I mean, for Bruce Wayne to go back and stop Brother Eye from ever being created in the first place. And just as I am wondering if he's planning to kill Mr. Terrific, create a future that's just as bad, and then have to go back and murder himself to stop himself from murdering Mr. Terrific, something awful happens and Terry has to go back instead. He finds himself stopping 5 years short of his temporal destination, and that's where we're left. I'm liking the colorful but edgy artwork so far, and I am intrigued by this writing team. We've got Brian Azzarello, Keith Griffin, Jeff Lemire, and one of my all-time favorites, Dan Jurgens. They're all plotting this together like one big committee, and having also read issue 1, which I'll review, of course, on New Acquisitions this week, I must say they seem to have their ducks much more in a row than DC's other current weekly series, Batman Eternal. I've got a lot of reservations about this, but I am willing to give it a chance as I love Terry McGinnis, and there's a dark quirkiness about this I can't deny enjoying. If you picked up issue 1 but not 0, see if you can get your hands on it, as this issue sets up the entire premise and it's essential. I have to give DC a lot of props for putting out a proper comic book for Free Comic Book Day that is a complete issue, all new material, and something that's valid for a new series, just like they did with Blackest Night, which they were highly praised for back when they did that. And at the risk of further berating Marvel for their Free Comic Book Day strategy, it really is too bad that they didn't set Original Sin back a few weeks and put Mark Waid's issue 0 out for that as a Free Comic Book Day issue, because it would have put this to shame. And now I want to talk about something kind of odd. This is Help the CBLDF Defend Comics. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on what company put this out. I think it's Monkey Brain, because they have a full ad in the back of this, but where the company seal usually would be on the front is an icon for CBLDF, which is the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, an organization about keeping comics free from censorship. And this comic is filled with little stories and political cartoons, all with that agenda in mind. It's all pretty sermony, and I feel like most of us reading this are probably the choir it's preaching to, but I actually found a lot of this insightful, informative, and entertaining. The majority of the material here is black and white history, heavily opinionated history lessons about censorship in comics, focusing mostly on Frederick Wortham and his seduction of the innocent, naturally, but also on the history of Mad Magazine, which was really enlightening to me, and I didn't realize the way censorship played into that. Although it's all politically slanted, the writing is surprisingly fair, giving Wortham his due in a way I've really never seen before. It outlines all of his positive contribution to the field of psychiatric medicine, which I had never really heard that much about, and criticizes the way history has been written for having left out his studies on schizophrenia, children's mental health, and his definitive textbook on brain psychology. It even suggests that Wortham had a point or two on the effect comics actually have on children, but that, of course, he blew the whole thing so far out of proportion that nobody really paid any attention to that, and he made the whole situation a lot worse by ruining a lot of good creators' careers and destroying good content with the Comics Code, which he ironically ended up hating even more than the lack of censorship in the first place, because it eliminated all consequences for violent actions in comics without eliminating the violence itself, which he rightly deemed a lot more dangerous for impressionable children. If you want a humorous, well-researched, but admittedly biased history lesson, there's a lot to learn here, and there's a lot of thoughtful, witty reading. Lastly, we have a book called Epic with a story by Tyler James and art by Max Zollman. The publisher here is Comics Tribe. This is a throwback to early Marvel stories about realistic, flawed characters just trying to get by, dealing with regular people problems, and winding up with unwanted responsibilities due to horrible accidents that result in incredible superpowers. It's basically an updated SpiderMan with a different set of powers and modern, more crude comedic sensibilities, but that same emphasis on advanced science gone too far, and the superhero metaphor for the awkwardness of being a teenager. It's an often clever, but also too often, at least for my taste, lewd comic, resorting too often to juvenile potty humor under the logic, I think, that that's just what kids find funny these days, and so it's realistic. Maybe, but it's also bordering too adult for the age group it sort of seems aimed at. Or maybe now that I'm pushing 30, I don't even know what's acceptable for preteens these days. And honestly, I find it tough to nail down an intended audience sometimes for a book like this, with so many Marvel villain knockoffs and such. I mean, it's relying really heavily on the material it's drawing from, and while I don't think any basic story has ever been told just so many times it can't be reimagined in a fresh way, this one seems to think it needs to directly reference its inspirations to legitimize itself constantly, so maybe it's more for adults who wane nostalgic for the comics of their youth, about youth. But anyway, I'm being too hard on it. There is a lot of genuine heart and genuine funny here, and the dialogue is mostly natural and authentic. It's an origin story, and the lab accident where Epic gets his powers is wonderfully absurd, as is his kryptonite. There's a decent mystery built around what's causing him to periodically lose his powers, and the puberty metaphor plays out to its furthest possible conclusion when we finally learn what it is. Now, I don't think this book is right for me, but it's good, if not clean fun, and there's definitely an audience for it, even if I'm not sure who exactly it's meant for. Well, that's it for me for now. I will have a dozen books for review, hopefully in short order, as well as some books I didn't read from Superhero Enthusiast coming here in the next day or so. Thanks, as always, to Elite Comics for helping out with the show. We got a lot of footage at Free Comic Book Day there for the film, and we want to thank them for participating and also for everything they do for the channel. If you would like to see anything reviewed on the Comic Vault, you can always send comics to our P.O. Box, and that's Geekvolution, P.O. Box 14183, Lenexa, Kansas 66285. Thanks again for watching, and as always, happy reading.